Welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show appearing on Facebook Live and the only place where Shaka gets to answer your questions. I am Jackson Vunganyi. Paul Ondiho is away on assignment, and here with me is Shaka himself, Mr. Shaka Sali. How are you doing today?
Well,
it's
Jackson,
such a pleasure to be here with you today.
Well, the feeling is mutual, Jackson. I have to say, frankly, that I'm hugely terrific, and you can see, of course, the heart that I am donning today.
I see that. I see that. Our Lance Spearman,
of
Lance
course.
Spearman. You know, a throwback in time.
A man that Jackson inspired those of us who were teenagers in the 60s, the late 60s.
Essentially one of Africa's first superheroes, black superheroes.
He arguably was, definitely, and he was born, I think, and raised somewhere in Southern Africa, probably South Africa for that matter. He was an incredibly smart guy, a guy that was dapper, a guy that enjoyed what he called scotch on the rocks and smoked cigars. And, you know, remarkably sophisticated. The type of guy that when you are that kind of young, really, he was so inspiring. And he reminded you, of course, of the one James Bond.
James Bond.
007.
007.
As reflected in some of the books of Ian Fleming.
Yes. And so where would you read, where would you access this Lance character?
There was a monthly magazine. Initially, I think that it was actually published by the popular, and I would call it my version of Bible, really, called Drum Magazine.
I remember the Drum Magazine, yes.
Yes.
Was it Kenya or South Africa?
Actually, it was published in South Africa, specifically in Soweto. But you did have the East Africa edition, and I think some of that probably was published in Nairobi, Kenya.
Right.
And then you had the West African edition, published out of Lagos and all that kind of stuff.
So you would read those on a monthly basis. When it comes out, you'll be looking forward to see the adventures of Lance Spearman.
Man, I couldn't wait. Unfortunately, at that time, I didn't have what it took to buy them.
Right.
So
and
I
finally, you
would end
pay
up
homage
begging,
to Lance Spearman today. You look dapper. I should say that.
Thank you so much, because you've given me the opportunity to walk back in memory lane.
Yes.
As Lance Spearman, which I couldn't do at the time.
So let's get to the business of today. So many things happening on the continent. So many questions came in on Facebook from your listeners who are very curious to know about what you think about so many of the issues that are happening. We'll start in Kenya. Yesterday, all over television, all over social media, a politician by the name of Miguna, who was earlier on deported, or a month ago, 2 months ago, was deported. I don't know whether he was actually deported because there's an issue on what that means. The High Court, currently he's being detained at the airport because there was a lot of drama about him refusing to get back on the plane and leave. But what do you think Kenya is giving away as a country that is being known as, you know, has a very good constitution, respect of, you know, rule of law. They just had obviously a contentious election. What is Kenya, the Kenyan government, giving away by pushing this issue ferociously?
It's very unfortunate, Jackson, because as you said, you actually rightly said, they have one of the most progressive documents, really, constitution. But you see, the trick is not simply having really a good constitution. It's also be willing, having the political will to implement and execute those aspects of the constitution, frankly, in the interest of the citizens of Kenya. Kenya is a great country. Frankly, Kenya doesn't belong in that type of league. It's very unfortunate, frankly, that we're talking about Miguna. Joseph Miguna, he used to be a guy who you rightly said was a lawyer, but unfortunately wasn't really that kind of a political giant, because let's face it, he offered himself to become the governor of Nairobi County, and he ended up with about 8,000 votes. But what the government of Kenya has actually done for him, frankly, it's like a magic. type of thing that has happened to him.
You kind of made the analogy of from a mall to a mountain type of...
From a molehill politically to what you would say, frankly, a huge political mountain. If that guy were to present himself tomorrow to run for governor of Nairobi, I bet, given what you've seen, he would be the governor. From
8,000 votes, he probably would win the election at this point.
He probably would.
And you alluded a little bit to Kenya's constitution being one of the most progressive on the continent, but a constitution is only a piece of paper if it's not respected or followed by the people who are supposed to protect it.
Precisely. In this particular case, you're talking about really court orders. Court orders which are issued by the Kenyan judiciary system. The Kenyan judiciary system happens obviously to be one of the three organs of what you call a government. And yet the executive in this particular case, frankly, doesn't seem to follow through.
Why do you think the president in this case, because I believe since the courts have ruled on this, the only I guess reason we would think that this is happening is that it's being pushed from above, from the president's office. So whoever it is that is pushing it is very high up there. Why are they doing this? What is the capital, the political capital here?
I really can't find any reason why anybody, for example, in Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta's position, frankly, would do this. This is a man, first of all, who pretty much grew up in the State House, Nairobi. He's very rich. His father did almost everything for him and what have you. He's a very sophisticated guy. He's been president for 6 years so far. I don't know why he would do this. I hope he's not the one, but even if he is not the one, remember the buck stops at his desk.
Right.
And he just had what you call a golden sort of political handshake with his arch-rival, Raila Odinga, on March 9th.
The reason why Miguna is actually in trouble is he presided over the swearing in of Raila Odinga.
The symbolic swearing in, of course, at Uhuru. But
right.
Mind you, guess how many people came to attend that symbolic, swearing in? Some estimates, in fact, say it's about 1 million plus. And look, Raila was until now probably the most perhaps popular politician in Kenya. But guess what? This could now actually be Miguna. Miguna right now is probably the most popular individual, not only probably in Kenya, probably on the entire continent.
Right. I mean, he was trending yesterday on social media around the continent. From Kenya, let's go right across the border to Uganda, your country, and to Rwanda, obviously, my country, a country that, I mean, they've had some issues with each other historically. They always fall out, they make up, they fall out, they make up. President Kagame was in Uganda, I think a couple of days ago, to meet his counterpart, Yoweri Museveni, to kind of squash the beef that has been. There's been bad blood in the last couple of months. What do you make of this relationship? What was the, do you know why the falling out in the first place?
Well, first of all, you know that when we go back to history, I mean, these two countries were very, very close, especially the two governments, really, one in Uganda under Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, and the other one in Kigali, and of course, Major General Paul Kagame, retired but not tired. The reason being, of course, they were at one time comrades in Uganda in what was referred to as National Resistance Movement and Army, that kind of, not the National Resistance Movement of Miguna.
Yeah, right.
Because he calls that one actually Kenya.
Yes.
They were in that situation, and the relationships were such that at that time, Yoweri Museveni was the master, and Paul Kagame was like a pupil. So there was a sort of relationship of
a teacher-student relationship.
Precisely. Yeah. One was probably
mentor,
a mentee, or protege or whatever,
right.
and that kind of stuff. But then again, you know, things changed back in 1994. And later, what happens in 1999? The two countries actually fight in the Eastern Democratic Republic
DRC,
of Congo. We're talking about Kisangani.
Right, right.
And they did not only fight once in 1999, they also fought for the second time in 2000. Those two armies had, you know, justified their being in that part of the Congo as actually fighting against, you know, bad guys and what have you, genocidaires they called them, and yet, let's face it, they were in fact fighting over the economic loot. They were fighting over someone who has access to diamonds, to gold, to timber, to coffee, those types of things. And there were a lot of people who died on both sides, but largely from what I have actually accessed, largely more people died from the Ugandan army. In fact, I was told about mass graves and all that kind of stuff. And so I think those two gentlemen...
So there's a resentment, there's still that resentment from that time, from the Ugandan side?
I think there is. I remember one time, in fact, I spent about more than 5 hours in a conversation in the Rwandan capital, Kigali, in the officers' mess in Kiyovu, with someone at the time was Vice President and Minister of Defense, Major Paul Kagame. The
current president.
That is correct. And at that time,
did you discuss
Colonel Patrick Karegeya.
Right.
It was October 1999.
Oh, okay.
And we were talking about the differences between Kampala and Kigali. And the complaint that Kagame had at the time was that the Rwandan officials really didn't seem to receive respect from the Ugandan counterparts.
Right.
They kept seeing them as...
They still saw them as I guess, subordinates in a way.
Something like that.
Yeah, because many of them were junior officers in the NRA at the time.
Yeah, so I don't think that these guys have ever really buried the hatchet. But it should really. There should be water under the bridge. They should move on, you know. But, you know, let's face it, I think part of the problem also is that I will argue very strongly that on both sides there's no democracy. There's no democracy.
What happens when both of them fight? When there's bad blood between Rwanda and Uganda, who suffers?
Well, the ordinary people of Rwanda and Uganda suffer. And the images of those countries also suffer. You don't need that. You don't need that.
Let's go to our first question from the audience. This question came in through Facebook Live, and the question is from one Deodato Carlos from Dodoma, Tanzania. He asks you, Shaka, which of these two do you think African countries really need now? He says, do African countries need more humanitarian aid, U.S. humanitarian aid, or Chinese direct involvement in African countries' economic activities?
I would say that ideally we really need neither. If only we could organize ourselves. If only we could begin to respect, for example, the fundamentals of democracy, we probably wouldn't need humanitarian aid.
Right.
The reason we need humanitarian aid is we find it so easy to somehow pick an AK-47 and cause a lot of problems for ourselves. And if we go into that situation, then obviously we are not in a position to feed ourselves sometimes and all that kind of stuff. And hence, you need to get humanitarian aid. And when you talk about the Chinese coming into Africa and carrying out some of these projects and what have you, it is a very good thing. But what about us? Can't we do some of those things for ourselves?
Right.
I think that the way the situation is right now, we obviously need both. But I would say that, frankly, at the end of the day, and I'm saying this from the deepest, better part of the bottom of my Cavalry heart and soul, it is up to us. If we are going to develop, if we are going to be respected globally, we have the responsibility, my friend. And I think we have a lot of, smart people. It's just that we do not have the appropriate environment.
And the resources.
Well, the resources, I don't think we have a problem. Let's face it. Africa
well
is
endowed.
probably the wealthiest continent on this planet Earth.
Right.
Why do you think the Chinese are coming to Africa?
Right, right.
It's not because of love. They're coming for the resources that we have.
Right.
Look, Jackson, when I was a kid, a guy, obviously, who admired Lance Spearman, I used to be told, I used to read in those drum magazines, Uganda Agus and what have you, that Africa produces what it does not consume and consumes what it does not produce. Up to today, Jackson, we still do the same thing. Why can't we get into manufacturing so that we can add value and liberate ourselves?
Right. Which brings me to the point, I was reading earlier today that the DRC government is saying that they will not take any aid from Western donors to help with their upcoming elections.
Yes.
But on the other hand, they're going to need $1.7 billion to respond to a humanitarian crisis that has been looming in parts of the country. So you see some of the irony there. You know, you need aid here, but sometimes you don't need it. And they're saying that if, you know, the reason why they're saying no to aid in this case is that it would amount to Western interference in their elections. And it makes you question, are they being genuine? Is this a government that is actually, I mean, given the history of Kabila of late, who has been a little not forthcoming with the truth on when he will hold the elections. He's been very hesitant. It was a lot of pressure from the opposition and, you know, Western donors who said, you know, he needs to hold the elections. And then all of a sudden he says, no, we won't need any of your help in holding the elections, but we are going to need your help, you know, humanitarian aid.
You know, again, you know, that is the contradiction. I honestly wish that what they are talking in terms of the elections, where they describe as they don't need what they call Western meddling in their sovereign affairs and all that kind of stuff. I wish there was some sort of consistency. You can't say, well, we don't need aid for the elections, but we don't mind having aid when it comes to education, when it comes to healthcare,
or feeding our people,
when it comes to humanitarian situation. No, you should be consistent. In fact, I wish Africa was proud enough, serious enough to deal with its problems.
To say no to aid.
Precisely, because let's face it, Jackson, when you have a house, you can't just go about complaining how the house is dirty. You must be able, first and foremost, to know that you have the responsibility to clean your house. Maybe you may not have some logistics. You may not have some kind of equipment or what have you.
Right.
In that case, you could actually get that one from somewhere else. But the primary responsibility of cleaning the house is up to you. It's up to you.
Right.
And I think that we should look in the context, we should look at our countries, we should look at the continent in that particular broad context.
Shaka, let's go to our second question from our Facebook listener, viewer. His name is Amos Chisisi. He asks you, he says, the African continent is democratic. The only problem is Western countries create wars amongst African states so that they can steal our resources. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that is stretching it too much because it again really...
Which part, the democracy part?
Yeah, it depends on what he means by the African continent being democratic. There are definitely some aspects on the African continent that you could rightly say are democratic. For example, I think that when it comes to communication, when it comes to dialogue, I can say without any fear of contradiction that when it comes to dialogue, dialogue is democratic in a cultural sense. Because you sit around, for example, a fireplace, and you don't discriminate among the different ages and what have you. And people begin telling stories and all kind of stuff. Precisely. Those types of things. And when it comes to being there for each other, holding your back in terms of culture and what have you, we have these sort of extended relationships. And sometimes in a lot of areas, in fact, even land is communal. It's not owned by specific individuals and leaving, the other people to probably not...
To fend for themselves.
Precisely.
Yeah,
so there are some aspects that are very, very democratic. And when you go to traditional society, you look at, for example, society, there is respect, there is fairness, they believe in terms of... accountability,
yes,
those types of things. So I think the Africa that has some problems for the most part is what you call the state, what we call governments, which are basically really reflections of who used to be in control of us, colonialism, because colonialism did not sincerely teach us to be democratic.
Yes, yes.
It was a dictatorship.
Yeah. This is a very interesting question from Onyeko Diallo from Lagos, Nigeria. He says, what is your take on the huge allowance so Nigerian politicians are collecting, Nigerian politicians are collecting huge allowances? I saw this story a couple of days ago where Nigerian politicians or members of parliament or senators are collecting up to over $37,000
US dollars a month, mind you. Can you imagine?
And speaking of that, we go back to Kenya, which has members of parliament, I think one of the highest paid
salaries
in the world.
And yet, by the way, they do not actually sit full time. But that is unconscionable. I mean, frankly, the people should probably take it upon themselves at the end of the day and say, you know what, we cannot tolerate this. When you go to some of these countries like Nigeria, you probably don't find appropriate medicines, maybe in hospitals and all that kind of stuff. When you go to visit some of the schools, they are probably dilapidated. Students probably do not have the appropriate exercise books and all the types of, things that they need in order for them to learn and all kind of stuff.
Right.
But here you are, you have some of these Nigerian civil servants sometimes who are arrested, and you find that an individual has more than 70 vehicles, and we're talking about
$40 million in cash.
The latest on the cutting edge. You're talking about Rolls Royce. You're talking about Mercedes, Benzes, Cadillacs.
Right.
You
ask, where do they get this money from?
Precisely. So I think that, again, what is needed is democracy. And we are glad, and we hope that God can actually help and give him more life, more energy. We're talking about the Nigerian president.
Muhammadu
Buhari, especially because he's really cracking a whip. He's attempting to crack a whip when it comes to the issue of corruption and what have you. But as somebody who knows Nigeria very well has told me, my brother, when it comes to fighting corruption in Nigeria, man, it's not easy.
It's pushing a mountain.
It's not easy.
Speaking of corruption, I think the story that right before we went on air that broke was that finally a date was set for former South African President Jacob Zuma to appear in court. April 6th, I believe,
yes, I saw
where
that.
He will face corruption charges. The police said Zuma was issued summons on Monday this week, which was yesterday, which continues his dramatic fall from grace. He's been accused, obviously, of many things, including corruption and spending over $20 million to renovate his house. What do you think about that type of, progress I guess you would call it progress if courts of law are able to hold a former leader who has been accused of corruption, hold him accountable finally?
I think you would look at it as remarkable progress, at least for Africa, in terms of democracy. South Africa obviously now has come to distinguish itself as probably the beacon of hope for African democracy. This is the only place, at least so far, in the last 20 years, we have had 2 presidents recalled from office for having behaved perhaps in a manner that was deemed to be inappropriate for their positions and all kind of stuff. The first person, of course, was Thabo Mbeki. You remember in 2008.
Right.
And the man who was leading the charge was none other than Jacobo Zuma,
right,
better known sometimes as Mushorozi. And now, on his watch, he also happens to be recalled by the same, you know, ruling ANC party, and now you have President Cyril Ramaphosa and what have you. I think it's a very good thing that at least we are dealing with the issues of accountability. My only problem is that how can you possibly be accused for having probably committed a crime of corruption and what have you, and yet your lawyers, in fact, are going to be paid for defending you to be paid by the state, by the government of South Africa. That's something I don't understand. Precisely. But I think it is a good thing, and there are a lot of people, of course, who are saying that, you know what, why do you really have to, you know, kind of like specifically target former President, you know, Jacobo Zuma, when you had decades of apartheid South Africa, whose leaders were never punished. Were never even taken to court.
You know, I understand. Yeah, that makes sense in a way, but that's that's a whole other conversation that we wouldn't be able to, you know, finish on this. But I want you to kind of preview for us. I know we're running short of time, as you always say. You know, time is not
of course the best ally. Yeah.
Can you preview for us what's happening tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
We're going to be talking about political transitions in Africa. And when we talk about political transitions, we obviously look at how, for example, power changes hands. In some places, it looks okay, like we are looking forward to a runoff in Sierra Leone, which will bring two candidates who are vying for State House, you know, Freetown. And it was supposed to be happening, in fact, today, but there was a court injunction. That there was some kind of fraud, you know, during the electioneering, you know, last week and all that kind of stuff. And yet, let's face it, this injunction was actually sought by members of the ruling party. I have not known, frankly, where oppositions have the opportunity and, you know, really have an opportunity where they can engage in what you would call vote rigging and all that kind of stuff, because these elections are generally run by government institutions, which are controlled by, obviously, a party in power.
Right, absolutely.
But we are going
the
to
incumbent party.
Yeah, but we are going to have, of course, the runoff on Saturday, March 31st.
And of course,
we'll see
how that goes.
There are ongoing elections, but some might actually wonder whether they're elections or not selections in Egypt. Right.
You know, that's something that when I came in, I wanted to talk to talk to you about, but we're out of time, and I want to thank you, Shaka, for giving us time to talk to us today, and thank all of you who sent in questions, and follow us on our social media accounts, Straight Talk Africa. And my Twitter is at Upfront Africa. We'll see you next time.